The combine is on fire. Not metaphorically, not almost on fire. It's October 14th, 1983, and the field along Moniteau Creek in Cooper County, Missouri, is lit orange against a sky the color of a bruise. Flames are licking up the grain elevator of a John Deere 6600 that belongs to a man named Dale Putnam, a man who has, in the last 48 hours, lost his third farmhand, discovered a seized bearing in his secondary harvester, and received a certified letter from the Boonville Savings and Loan that he did not open because he already knew what it said. And now this. Dale Putnam stands 40 yards back from the burning machine, his hands at his sides, a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich still in his left fist, watching $7,200 of iron and hydraulic fluid turn into a column of black smoke visible from the highway. And here is the thing that will define the rest of this story. He doesn't panic. He takes one long breath, looks down at the sandwich, takes another bite, and says, to no one in particular, to the smoke, to the October wind moving across his ruined field, "All right then, we do it the other way." This is the story of Dale Putnam, and what he meant by the other way. Let me tell you about Cooper County, Missouri, in the fall of 1983. It sits in the center of the state, in the great arc of farmland that bends along the Missouri River country that Meriwether Lewis called the most fertile and beautiful he had ever seen. The soil there is a dark, silty loam laid down over 10,000 years of river overflow, deep and black as coffee grounds, and in a good year it will grow corn that stands 10 feet tall and soybeans that seem to breathe in the August heat. In a bad year, and 1983 was, for reasons we will get to, a very bad year, the same ground can feel like it's working against you. The air in October smells of cut stalks and creek mud and diesel exhaust, and underneath all of it, something older, the mineral smell of turned earth, the smell of a continent still insisting on its own nature. The mornings coming cold now, frost sitting on the windshields of pickup trucks parked in gravel driveways, burning off by 9. The afternoons are golden and deceptive, warm enough to make you forget winter is already sharpening its teeth. The farms along Route K south of Boonville, that's the county seat, a river town with a population of about 7,000, are mixed-size operations mostly. Family places held for 2 and 3 generations. The Putnams have been on their 340 acres since 1941, when Dale's father, Warren Putnam, bought it from a bank that was tired of holding the note after the previous owner walked away during the drought years. Warren Putnam worked that land with horses until 1957. He planted by the moon, composted before composting was a word anyone used, and never, not once in 30 years, turned the soil deeper than 4 inches. He had reasons for that. Old reasons, we'll come back to them. In 1983, Dale Putnam is 51 years old. He is a medium-sized man with large, careful hands and a face that looks like it was assembled from things found outdoors, weathered, angular, permanently squinted from decades of reading skis. He drives a 1974 Ford F-250 with 187,000 miles on it. He wears the same canvas jacket from October through March. He is not a man who wastes words or motion, and in Cooper County, that is considered the highest compliment you can pay a person. Let me tell you about Dale Putnam properly, because you need to understand what kind of man we are dealing with before you can understand what he was about to do. Dale had taken over the farm from Warren in 1969, when his father's arthritis got bad enough that he couldn't operate the equipment. Dale was 37 then, fresh from a decade of working as an agricultural extension agent out of the University of Missouri, a job that had taken him to farms all across the state, studying what worked and what didn't, listening to old farmers talk about soil and seasons the way other men talked about scripture. He had a degree in agronomy. He had read papers from university research stations in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. He subscribed to Soil Science Society of America journal, which made him, as far as anyone in Cooper County was concerned, an eccentric. His neighbor, Roy Stenger, once said that Dale Putnam was the kind of man who would research a fence post. He meant it as a joke. Dale took it as a compliment. But here's what matters. Dale had spent those years as an extension agent watching good farms turn bad. He had seen topsoil blow off fields in dry springs and wash down creek banks in wet ones. He had stood in fields where the ground had been worked so hard and so deep for so many consecutive years that it had the texture of concrete an inch below the surface, what soil scientists call a hardpan, and nothing with roots could push through it. He had watched farmers spend money they didn't have on inputs, fertilizer, herbicide, more fuel for bigger tractors to pull deeper plows, to compensate for soil that was getting sicker every year, and he had come back to his father's farm in 1969 with a quiet, building certainty that the whole industry was pointed in exactly the wrong direction. The farm Dale inherited was carrying $43,000 in debt, modest by the standards of the era, when land prices were rising fast and banks were urging farmers to expand. Dale did not expand. He paid down the debt steadily through the 1970s, growing corn and soybeans on a rotation, selling calves from a small Angus herd, and doing something that made his neighbors shake their heads. He was gradually, quietly, systematically reducing how deep he tilled. By 1981, he had stopped turning the soil altogether on 120 of his 340 acres. He called it his experiment. His neighbors called it something less polite. Now, every story needs its antagonist, and in the farming country of 1983 Cooper County, Missouri, the antagonist wore a John Deere green cap, drove a new Silverado, and went by the name of Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch was 44 years old and operated the largest farming operation in the county, 1,800 acres of his own land and another 600 rented from absentee owners out of St. Louis. He grew corn, soybeans, and winter wheat on an industrial scale. He owned 4 John Deere 4440 tractors, a pair of 6,600 combines, a grain dryer the size of a small building, and a reputation for being, as the people of Boonville would carefully say when Gerald wasn't in earshot, difficult. Gerald Fitch had come into serious money in the late 1970s, when land prices were climbing by double digits annually and the government was paying export premiums on grain. He had leveraged his acreage to buy more acreage, borrowed against rising land values to buy newer equipment, and by 1982 was carrying about $2.1 million in farm debt, which, at the interest rates of that era, was running him roughly $220,000 a year in interest payments alone. Gerald was the kind of man who confuses scale with intelligence. He believed that bigger equipment meant better farming, that more inputs meant more yield, that the only thing standing between a man and success was not working hard enough or not spending boldly enough. He had expanded his operation every single year for 7 years, and every year it had worked out, and this had made him not just confident but something colder than confident, contemptuous of caution, dismissive of doubt. He wore his success loudly. He sat at the front of the county farm bureau meetings and offered opinions on subjects he had only a passing familiarity with. He knew, specifically, what he thought of Dale Putnam and Dale Putnam's experiment. He had said it in the parking lot of the Boonville Co-op more than once. That man is farming in his sleep. You want to see what happens when a man stops plowing? Drive down Route K, look at those weeds. The people who stood in that parking lot, the ones who nodded along, didn't know something that Gerald Fitch didn't know either. The weeds weren't weeds. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room or a field or a parking lot when someone was laughing at an idea and you had the distinct feeling that the person laughing was the only one who didn't understand the joke, that the joke was actually on them and they were the last to know? That is exactly what was happening in Cooper County in the fall of 1983. But before we get to the punchline, we have to go through the humiliation. It was the annual Cooper County Farm Bureau meeting, held the third Thursday of October at the Boonville Elks Lodge, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of cigarette smoke and industrial coffee, and the particular anxiety of men who had been watching commodity prices fall for 18 months. Corn was sitting at $2.86 a bushel. Soybeans were at $7.20. Interest rates, though they had begun to ease from their catastrophic 1981 peaks, were still running above 12% on most farm operating loans. People were scared. When people are scared and gathered in a room together, they often look for someone to make them feel better by making someone else look smaller. That night, that someone was Dale Putnam. Dale had come to the meeting because he always came to the meeting. He sat in the third row with his canvas jacket on his lap and a cup of the industrial coffee in his hand. Gerald Fitch sat up front, as always, turned sideways in his chair so he could address the room as much as the speaker. The Farm Bureau County Director, a man named Ed Vogel, was talking about the 1983 Payment-in-Kind program, the federal program that year where the government was paying farmers not to plant, to reduce the surplus that was crushing prices. It was, depending on how you look at it, either a lifeline or an embarrassment, and the men in that room had complicated feelings about it. Gerald Fitch stood up. He had a lot to say about PIK and about the farm crisis in general, and he said most of it loudly and with great confidence. And then he turned to the room and said, "You know who I don't feel sorry for? Farmers who aren't producing. Farmers who have got fields sitting there going to weed because they can't be bothered to keep their equipment running or their rows straight." He paused. He let his eyes move across the room and settle, not quite accidentally, on Dale Putnam. "I heard," Gerald said, and now his voice dropped into that register that means I've been saving this, "that somebody around here decided the answer to the farm crisis is to stop plowing altogether." He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Now, I don't know much, but I know this: the day I stop working my ground is the day you can bury me in it." The room laughed, not everyone, but enough. Dale Putnam did not laugh. He didn't look away either. He looked at Gerald Fitch with the expression of a man reading a weather instrument neutrally for information, and then he looked down at his coffee. Ed Vogel tried to steer the meeting back to PIK, but Gerald wasn't finished. "I mean it seriously," he said. "You can't just let ground sit. Ground doesn't take care of itself. You've got to work it. You've got to break it up, get the air in, get the crop residue turned under. That's farming. That's what our fathers did and their fathers did." He looked at Dale again. "Some people forget that." Dale Putnam set his coffee cup down on the empty chair beside him. He buttoned the top button of his canvas jacket, and then he said, quietly enough that people had to stop their side conversations to hear him, "Your fathers plowed because they didn't have another option. I do." And then he stood up, said goodnight to Ed Vogel, and walked out. The room was silent for about 3 seconds. And then Gerald Fitch said something that several people would remember for the rest of their lives. "That man is going to lose that farm by spring." Let me tell you what Dale Putnam knew. He knew it partly from books. He knew it partly from the 15 years he had spent as an extension agent, watching. But he knew it mostly from his father, Warren, a man who had never attended a university in his life, but who had, by the time Dale was 10 years old, taught his son to read soil the way other men read scripture. Warren Putnam had a phrase he used. He said, "The ground knows what it's doing. Your job is to stay out of its way." What Warren understood, and what the agricultural science of the 1970s and 1980s was only beginning to confirm in the research journals Dale read, was this: soil is not a medium. It is not a neutral growing surface into which you insert seeds and add chemicals and extract crops. Soil is a living system. A single tablespoon of healthy farmland contains more living organisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, insects, a churning, interconnected community of life that does, for free, what farmers spend billions of dollars trying to do with synthetic inputs. This community builds channels, what agronomists call macropores, that move water down through the soil profile instead of letting it run off. It binds soil particles into aggregates that resist erosion. It breaks down crop residue into organic matter that feeds the next generation of crops. It fixes nitrogen from the air. It suppresses certain pathogens. And plowing destroys it. Every time you run a plow through the ground, especially a moldboard plow that turns the soil completely upside down, you are essentially detonating a bomb inside that biological community. You kill the fungal networks that have been growing for decades. You expose the organic matter to oxygen, causing it to oxidize and disappear into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. You disrupt the macropore structure, leaving the soil more compacted and less able to absorb water after the initial tillage loosens things up. And then you have to till again because the soil is now compacted again, and so you are on a treadmill, plowing to fix the damage caused by plowing. Warren Putnam hadn't known any of this in scientific terms. He knew it the way a man knows a temperamental mule, by feel, by observation, by noticing what happened when he behaved one way versus another. He had plowed his fields for the first decade he owned them and watched the soil darken and crust at the surface. He had stopped largely on instinct, and the fields had thanked him. Dale had taken his father's instinct and married it to the science. By the early 1980s, he was following the work coming out of Purdue University and Ohio State, researchers like Norm Fossey and Howard Doster who were documenting yield data from no-till plots going back years. He was in correspondence with Edward Faulkner, who had written Plowman's Folly back in 1943, a book that the agricultural establishment had dismissed as heretical and that Dale kept in his office alongside his soil science journals. He had attended a field day in Indiana in 1979 and seen what no-till soybeans looked like on a farm that had been practicing it for 7 years. The yields were within a few percent of conventionally tilled plots, the input costs were dramatically lower, and the soil looked alive in a way that tilled ground simply didn't. He had come home from that field day and made a decision. Now here is the practical piece, because I know you're wondering about the weeds. The knock on no-till farming in the early 1980s was weed control. If you don't plow, you don't bury your weed seeds, and if you don't bury them, they germinate on the surface and compete with your crop. Gerald Fitch wasn't entirely wrong about this. In a poorly managed no-till system, weeds will eat you alive. Dale Putnam's answer to this was a machine. Specifically, it was a 1971 Ty Paratil, a subsoiler, not a plow, that Dale had purchased used from a retiring farmer in Saline County for $1,400 in 1977. The Paratil ran narrow shank straight down into the soil, 18 to 24 inches deep, fracturing the hardpan without turning the surface. It preserved the topsoil biology while breaking up the compaction layer that was preventing water infiltration. Dale used it once on each field and then never used it again on that field, because once you broke the hardpan and the biological channels grew back in, the ground maintained itself. For weed control, he was using something new, a no-till drill, specifically a John Deere 750 no-till grain drill he had purchased in 1981 for $8,200, a significant investment that planted directly into the undisturbed residue of the previous crop. The residue on the soil surface suppressed weed germination the way a mulch does in a garden. Combined with targeted, low-rate herbicide applications in the spring, a quarter of what Gerald Fitch was putting on per acre, it kept the weeds manageable without the plow. The fields along Route K that Gerald Fitch had called weedy, that surface cover was mostly clover and winter rye that Dale had planted deliberately, a cover crop, which is to say a crop grown not to harvest but to feed the soil, to hold it in place through winter, to add organic matter when it died down in spring. Dale Putnam wasn't farming in his sleep. He was farming 30 years ahead of his time. The spring of 1984 arrived in Cooper County like an argument. April brought rain, not the gentle, soaking kind, but the hard, fast kind that comes in curtains off the west and runs across the surface of the ground and fills the creek bottoms in hours. Between April 3rd and April 19th, the Boonville weather station recorded 4.7 inches of rain, nearly all of it delivered in 4 heavy events. The Missouri River was up. Moniteau Creek was bank full, and the fields of Cooper County were saturated and in many places simply inaccessible. Let me pause here and ask you something. When a farmer can't get his equipment into his fields because the ground is too wet, what happens? He waits. And every day he waits is a day he's not planting. And every day he's not planting is a day he's falling behind the optimal planting window. Miss that window, especially for corn, and you're looking at a yield drag of 1 to 2% per day. Miss it by 3 weeks, which a wet spring could easily cost you, and you've lost 20 to 30% of your yield before you've put a seed in the ground. In April of 1984, Gerald Fitch waited 19 days before his fields were dry enough to work. 19 days of watching the sky and the calendar and doing the math on what he was losing. When he finally got in, his conventional tillage operation plow disc again drag took an additional 8 to 12 days on his 1,800 acres. By the time Gerald Fitch had his first corn in the ground, it was May 14th. Dale Putnam planted his first field on April 24th. His no-till ground, with its surface residue and its intact biological channels, had drained well enough to support equipment 11 days before Gerald's bare-tilled fields. The John Deere 750 drill, that machine Gerald had never heard of, that machine that looked to conventional farmers like a contraption, like something out of left field, ran through the standing winter rye cover crop and dropped seed directly into the soil below. Precise depth. Consistent moisture contact. No tillage pass required before, no tillage pass required after. By April 30th, Dale had corn in the ground on 180 of his 340 acres. On May 2nd, it rained again, another 1.5 inches. Gerald Fitch lost 4 more days. Dale Putnam lost nothing. His residue-covered ground absorbed the rain, not perfectly, but well enough. He was back planting on May 4th. He finished his last field on May 9th. Now let me tell you about what happened in early June. The same month that Dale's corn was emerging in a strong, even stand, knee-high by the 15th, which is the old farmer benchmark, Cooper County got a dry spell. 18 days without meaningful rain. The kind of dry that causes conventional farmers to lie awake listening for the sound of moisture they know isn't coming. In Gerald Fitch's fields, corn was already showing stress, the telltale rolling of leaves, the bluish color shift that means a plant is conserving water. His bare-tilled soil, with its broken structure and oxidized organic matter and absent biological channels, had very little capacity to hold water against the dry. The moisture that had been in his topsoil had evaporated from the exposed surface. His corn was struggling. In Dale Putnam's fields, the surface residue was doing its job. It was acting as a mulch, holding soil moisture, reducing evaporative loss, keeping the soil temperature lower. The earthworm channels and fungal networks, undisturbed for 3 years on his older no-till ground, were pulling water down from the surface when it rained and holding it in the profile when it didn't. His corn was not rolling. It was dark green and growing. By the first week of July, when the county extension agent, a young man named Bill Carver, 28 years old, fresh out of Mizzou, drove down Route K on his routine field visits, he pulled over twice. He pulled over the first time to look at a field of Gerald Fitch's corn. It was uneven. Some areas were recovering from the dry spell. Some areas where compaction was worst or organic matter had been most depleted were clearly behind. He noted it and drove on. He pulled over the second time at the field line of Dale Putnam's farm. He sat in his truck for a long moment. The corn was tall, uniform, a deep particular green that agronomists learned to associate with adequate nitrogen and adequate moisture and an absence of stress. The canopy was closed, meaning the leaves were touching between rows, shading the soil, which meant no moisture evaporating from the surface, which meant the system was self-reinforcing. Bill Carver had, in his 2 years on the job, already been told by his supervisors to be cautious about endorsing no-till. The chemical companies that sponsored many of the extension programs had complicated feelings about a practice that reduced input costs. The farm equipment dealers who relied on the county's goodwill also had complicated feelings about a practice that required only 1 pass of a drill, rather than 6 passes of assorted tillage equipment. Bill Carver looked at Dale Putnam's field and thought about those complicated feelings and decided privately that they were not his problem. He picked up his clipboard and wrote down what he saw. Yield estimates would come later, but the story the field was telling was already clear. The harvest came in October. Dale Putnam's corn averaged 147 bushels per acre. Gerald Fitch's corn averaged 109 bushels per acre. Now let me put that in terms that cut through any abstraction. At $3.10 per bushel, which is roughly what corn was trading at the local elevator in October 1984, that 38 bushel per acre difference meant that Dale Putnam, on his 180 acres of no-till corn, produced gross revenue of approximately $82,000. Gerald Fitch, on roughly 600 acres of comparable ground, produced about $202,000, which sounds like more until you account for what each man spent to get there. Dale Putnam's tillage costs, essentially zero. His herbicide costs, roughly $18 per acre. His fuel costs, with 1 planting pass and 1 residue pass instead of multiple tillage operations, about $12 per acre. His total production costs per acre were later calculated by Bill Carver, who wrote it all up in a county extension report, at $189 per acre. Gerald Fitch's tillage costs, 4 passes of heavy equipment. His herbicide costs, $47 per acre. His fuel, $41 per acre. Total production costs, $312 per acre. Gerald Fitch made more gross revenue because he farmed more land. But on a per-acre basis, on comparable ground in the same county in the same year, Dale Putnam netted nearly $70 more per acre. And there was one more number. Gerald Fitch, in the fall of 1984, could not make his interest payments. The combination of the late planting, the yield drag from dry stress, the high input costs, and the continuing pressure of $2.1 million in debt at rates that had not fallen as fast as the farm crisis optimists had promised. It was too much. In November of 1984, Gerald Fitch went to the Boonville Savings and Loan and told them he needed to restructure his debt. The bank, which was itself under pressure from federal regulators about its agricultural loan portfolio, said they would think about it. In January of 1985, they stopped thinking about it and started foreclosing. The man who had stood in the Elks Lodge and told a room full of frightened farmers that Dale Putnam would lose his land by spring, that man was signing over title to 400 acres of his own land to a savings institution by February. There was no public moment, no parking lot crowd. No one laughed. You don't laugh at a man in that situation, not in farm country. People understood too well how thin the margin was, how fast a run of bad luck and high interest could undo decades of work. But there was a silence. The specific silence of a room, the Farm Bureau meeting, October 1984, when Ed Vogel read off the county's top corn producers and Dale Putnam's name appeared for the first time in anyone's memory at the top of the list. Gerald Fitch was not at that meeting. The room was very quiet for a moment. And then someone started clapping, slowly, and then the whole room was clapping, and Dale Putnam sat in the third row with his canvas jacket on his lap and looked at the floor and nodded once, as if this were a small matter, as if he were thanking someone for passing the salt. Let me tell you what happened next, not just to Dale Putnam, but to the idea he had been carrying. Bill Carver's extension report on Dale's 1984 results was circulated through the University of Missouri Extension Network in early 1985. It was modest in its claims. Bill was a careful writer, but its data was clear. In a county that had experienced significant weather stress, one farmer using no-till practices had outperformed conventional tillage significantly on both yield and profitability. The report made it to a researcher at the University of Missouri named Dr. S. Joard Niesenberg, who was studying soil compaction and water infiltration in Missouri River bottomlands. Dr. Niesenberg drove down to Cooper County in the spring of 1985 and spent 2 days in Dale Putnam's fields with a penetrometer and a bucket and a soil probe, taking samples every 50 feet. What he found confirmed what Dale already knew. The no-till ground had soil organic matter levels of 3.8%, compared to an average of 1.9% on conventionally tilled fields of similar parent material in the county. It had earthworm populations 4 to 6 times higher. Its water infiltration rate, the speed at which rainwater moved into the soil rather than running off, was more than twice the county average. Dr. Niesenberg published his findings in 1986 in the Missouri Cooperative Extension Bulletin series. He credited Dale Putnam by name. The bulletin was read by extension agents in 17 states. In 1987, Dale Putnam hosted the first field day on his farm. 43 farmers from Cooper, Moniteau, Morgan, and Saline counties tramped across his fields in October, listening to him talk about soil biology and no-till drills and cover crops in his quiet, careful way. A journalist from the Columbia Missourian wrote a small story about it. The headline was, "Boonville Farmer Says the Plow Has Had Its Day." The letters to the editor ran for 3 weeks. Some were supportive, some were angry. One retired farmer from Moniteau County wrote that Dale Putnam was a fool who got lucky and is teaching other fools to follow him. It was, arguably, the most discussed letter to the editor in the Missourian that year. Dale kept farming. By 1989, he had converted all 340 acres to no-till. His debt was paid off. He had replaced the burned-out 6600 combine, the one from our opening scene, with a used 1979 John Deere 7700 that he bought for $11,500 and maintained himself. He kept the tie Paratil. He bought a second no-till drill, a 1988 Kins 2000, for fields with heavier residue. He was profiled in No-Till Farmer magazine in 1991. The profile quoted him as saying, "I'm not doing anything revolutionary. I'm doing what the ground always wanted me to do. I was just stubborn enough to listen." His son, Marcus Putnam, came back to the farm in 1993 after studying agronomy at Mizzou. Marcus would, in subsequent years, add precision soil sampling, GPS-guided planting, and eventually become something of a regional authority on soil health, invited to speak at conferences in Kansas City and Chicago on the same topics his father had practiced in obscurity for 20 years. In 2001, when the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service began formally promoting conservation tillage under the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, offering cost-share payments to farmers who adopted no-till and cover cropping, the framework they used, the logic, the methodology, the understanding of what healthy soil could do, was built on exactly the research that Dale Putnam's fields had helped generate 15 years earlier. And what of the 400 acres Gerald Fitch lost? They were purchased at auction in 1985 by an investment group out of Kansas City. They were rented back to a series of conventional operators through the late 1980s and 1990s. By 2005, the soil organic matter on those fields had declined further, the yields were below county average, and the rental rates were falling because the ground simply wasn't performing. In 2008, Marcus Putnam made an offer on 120 of those acres. The investment group, tired of the underperformance, accepted. Within 6 years of Marcus's no-till management, the organic matter on those fields had risen from 1.4% to 2.6%. The earthworms came back, the yields came up. The ground remembered. It always does. Let me close here because this is where the story earns its keep. We live in a moment when newness is worshipped, when disruption is the highest compliment, when the person who tears down and rebuilds is celebrated above the person who tends and preserves. There is something seductive about that story. It flatters a certain kind of ambition. But there is another kind of wisdom, older, quieter, harder to Instagram, that says, before you change a thing, understand what it's doing. Before you plow it under, ask what lives there. Before you call something a weed, ask what work it might be doing. Dale Putnam didn't invent no-till farming. Farmers in many parts of the world had never adopted the plow-based system in the first place. Edward Faulkner had written about it in 1943. Soil scientists had been documenting it for decades. What Dale did was something both simpler and harder. He paid attention. He listened to his father. He read the journals. He watched the fields. He had the patience to let an idea prove itself over years, not months, and the stubbornness to keep going when people with louder voices and bigger equipment called him a fool. The farm crisis of the 1980s destroyed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 American farm families. The causes were complex: interest rates, commodity prices, federal policy, speculation in land values. But threaded through that catastrophe as a recurring, under-examined factor was the cost structure of farming. The machinery, the fuel, the chemicals. The debt required to sustain an industrial system that had forgotten something fundamental about how soil works. The farmers who survived, not all of them, but a significant and documented number, were often the ones who had found a way to reduce their dependence on inputs, who had lower overhead, who had, in some cases without knowing the academic term for it, built a measure of resilience into their land. Dale Putnam survived not because he was luckier, not because the weather loved him, but because he had invested for 15 years before anyone was watching in something that could not be repossessed or foreclosed upon, the living biology of his own soil. Here is what I want you to carry away from this. The things that are oldest are not always the things that need to be discarded first. Sometimes the man who looks like he's doing nothing, who isn't plowing, who isn't churning, who is simply watching and tending and waiting, is the man doing the most important work. Sometimes the wisdom that looks like stubbornness is what saves you. And sometimes the loudest man in the room is the one who understands the least about the ground beneath his feet. Dale Putnam still farmed his land until 2003, when a second hip replacement made operating equipment impractical. He passed the farm to Marcus that year in a transaction that involved no lawyers and no bank and no ceremony beyond a handshake and a cup of coffee at the kitchen table where Warren Putnam had once sat and talked about the nature of soil. He died in 2011 at 79. The obituary in the Boonville Daily News was 4 paragraphs. It mentioned his military service, his family, his membership in the First Methodist Church, and in the final sentence, almost as an afterthought, his farming. The people who understood what that farming meant needed no more than a sentence. The ground along Moniteau Creek, dark and deep and alive, is still there. It remembers. Historical context is real. The farm crisis of the early 1980s, payment-in-kind program No-till farming research at Purdue and Ohio State universities, and soil science described in this video reflect documented history. The Ty-Paratil John Deere 750 no-till drill and John Deere 6600 and 7700 combines are real machines. Cooper County, Missouri and Boonville exist. Characters, names, and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this story meant something to you, if you know a farmer like Dale Putnam or you are one, leave a comment below. Subscribe to The Forgotten Farmer. These stories deserve to be told.